The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. This silly sentence contains all of the letters of the alphabet, and you might notice it also is stuffed full of adjectives. In this video, we'll talk about what adjectives are and how to use them in a sentence. An adjective is a word that describes a noun. It describes something's size, color, age, origin, material, or shape. Adjectives can be used to make the subject simpler to understand and to shed light on what an author wants their ideas to truly convey. The adjectives used in the sentence about the fox and the dog are quick and brown, describing the fox, and lazy, which describes the dog. Here's another example. She's the smartest student in the class. Student is the noun, and smartest is describing what kind of student she is. So smartest is the adjective. Shakespeare has been credited for adding hundreds of new words to the English language when he was writing, and many of those were adjectives. Some examples of Shakespearean adjectives are, "Thou cold-blooded slave, hast thou not spoke like thunder on my side, been sworn my soldier, bidding me depend upon thy stars, thy fortune and thy strength, and dost thou now fall over to my fours?" Cold-blooded is an adjective that describes the slave. It helps us to know what type of person the slave was. Cold-blooded is a word that had been used to describe snakes and reptiles, but Shakespeare used it for the first time to describe a person. Here's an example from the book Little Women. She remembered her mother's promise and, slipping her hand under her pillow, drew out a little crimson-covered book. Crimson-covered describes the color of fabric that was covering the book. As you can see, using adjectives can make your sentences and ideas come to life. Instead of just saying that the firework display was beautiful, you can make it much more exciting and easier to envision what the fireworks actually looked like by saying, "The fireworks this year were bursting brightly overhead as the bright, dazzling sparkles lit up the sky." Bright and dazzling are just two of the many, many adjectives that make writing so descriptive and fun to read.
Describing situations in detail helps readers more vividly understand what is taking place. When describing things in more detail, adverbs are a helpful addition to make your sentences more colorful and portray the event clearly. In this video, we'll take a look at what adverbs do, how to identify them, and how to best use them in our writing. Let's get started. The easiest way to find an adverb in a sentence is to ask these questions. Where was something done? When was it done? How was it done? And to what extent was it done? An adverb will always answer one of those questions. For example, the adverb here answers the question, where? And the adverb randomly answers the question, how? An easy identifier for adverbs is the suffix ly. Not all adverbs use it, but the majority of adverbs do. Let's identify some adverbs by using our 4 questions. She went outside and walked the dog. Do any of those words in the sentence answer the question where, when, how, or to what extent? In this example, we see that outside is the adverb because it tells us where she went. Let's look at another. They briskly jogged through the park. Here, we see that the word briskly answers the question how something was done, making it the adverb in the sentence. Let's try one more example. She almost tripped while jogging, but regained her balance. This one might be tricky. In this example, we see that almost describes the extent to which something happens, which in this case was tripped. She almost tripped, making almost the adverb here. Adverbs not only modify verbs, they are also used to describe comparisons of two things. Adverbs have 3 degrees of comparison: positive, comparative, and superlative. The best way to explain positive, comparative, and superlative adverbs is to think of them as well, better, and best. When we want to describe the quality of something, we can say the thing itself is done well. That would be a positive adverb. We may compare that thing to something else and say, this thing is better than something else, which is known as a comparative adverb. Or we may simply say, this thing is the best, which is superlative. As you can see, with each comparison, the degree of its descriptor is increased. There are many ways of changing adverbs from positive to comparative and superlative. Let's go over each one with real examples and see how they differ. What's important to note about positive adverbs is that the words used don't necessarily have to be positive or good words. For example, the word badly is a positive adverb because it is the first or basic degree you can use to describe something without comparing it to anything else. Many adverbs can be modified to show different degrees by simply adding er or est to the end of the word. Adding er to a word makes it comparative, meaning it's not the most of something, but it is more than something else. Adding est to the end of a word means that the word it is describing is the most of something, and nothing can be compared as being better than it. Here's an example. He ran through the field faster than his sister. In this example, the adverb faster responds to the question of how something was done. We also know this is a comparative adverb because of the added er to the end of fast. This lets us know that this person ran at a higher speed compared to his sister. Here's another example. She was the quickest of everyone who ran the 5K. Here we see the adverb quickest answers the question of how something was done. Because there is an est at the end of quick, we know that this adverb is superlative because no one else ran more quickly than this person. Some adverbs, especially those that end in ly, can't have their degrees increased to comparative or superlative forms by simply adding er or est to the end. These adverbs must have more and most preceding the word to be modified. Let's look at a few examples. The crowd cheered for her more joyfully than for the other performers. Here we can see that joyfully is the adverb because it answers the question of how the crowd cheered. We can also see that joyfully is a comparative adverb because of the word more before it. With this, we know that the crowd cheered more, but not the most joyfully. He completed his task most efficiently of all the employees. Again, in this example, the adverb efficiently is easy to spot, not only because it ends in ly, but because it answers the question of how the task was performed. We also find the word most preceding efficiently, which means this is a superlative adverb and no task was completed more efficiently than his. Some adverbs can't be made comparative and superlative with the use of er, est, more, or most. For irregular adverbs, changing their degree of comparison means changing the word and its spelling entirely. There is no special trick to these irregular adverbs, so they must be memorized over time to understand their implied degree of comparison. The word badly is an example of an irregular adverb. To make it comparative, you wouldn't say more badly or badlier. The comparative form of badly is worse, and the superlative form is worst. Other examples of irregular adverbs include little, which becomes less and least, and good, which becomes better and best. Now, let's look at adverbial phrases. Adverbial phrases perform the same function as adverbs and describe when, how, to what extent, and where something happens. What makes them different from normal adverbs is they are phrases, which means they are a group of two or more words and they don't always contain a typical ly adverb in the phrase. Here are some examples that answer the question, when? He goes camping every summer. They are going to sleep earlier than usual. Here, these highlighted phrases signify a time in which something occurs. In this sentence, he was driving haphazardly and recklessly. This adverbial phrase is made up of two adverbs and a conjunction to make a phrase that describes how something occurred. An adverbial clause is similar to an adverbial phrase. However, adverbial clauses, just like the name suggests, are clauses, which means they contain a subject, verb, and subordinating conjunction. Let's look at some examples. Sit at the table until your food is eaten. In this example, the adverbial clause, until your food is eaten, describes when something occurs. We also know it is a clause because it has a subject, food, and verb, eaten, as well as a subordinating conjunction, until. My sister, although she was hungry, wouldn't eat until I arrived. Here, the adverbial clause starts with a subordinating conjunction, although has a subject, she, and a verb, is. Together, they describe the extent to which the sister wouldn't eat. Make sure you are polite to people wherever you go. This example shows the subordinating conjunction wherever, the subject you, and verb go to show when something happened. Before we go, let's do a little practice to refresh what we've learned. Number 1, which of the following are not adverbs? A, entirely, B, rather, C, them, or D, cautiously. The answer is C, them. The word them is a pronoun. Number 2, the highlighted word is an example of what? Some people agree that Serena Williams is the greatest athlete of all time. A, adverbial phrase, B, subordinating conjunction, C, comparative adverb, or D, superlative adverb. The answer is D, superlative.
I've told you to clean your room a million times. When I was your age, I had to walk 15 miles to school barefoot in the snow. Ever heard statements like that before? These are examples of an overstatement, or hyperbole, which is one of the things we'll be looking at in this video. We'll also be looking at the opposite of a hyperbole, an understatement, and how writers use these figures of speech to enhance their work. So, as you can tell from those two examples, a hyperbole is defined as obvious and intentional exaggeration. It's an extravagant statement or figure of speech that is not intended to be taken literally. We use hyperbole, or at least hear it, quite often in day-to-day conversation. For example, you might say to a friend, "I haven't seen you in an eternity." You saw this friend just last week, but to get the point across that it has felt like a long time, you exaggerate by using a word that implies it's been forever. Since this is an exaggeration and is not meant to be taken literally, it is a hyperbole. It is crucial to keep in mind that there are certain elements that make a hyperbole's function differ depending on context. In this case, the word eternity was used to create emphasis, but in a different situation, it could be used ironically. If you just recently saw your friend and coincidentally encountered him 20 minutes later, then making the same hyperbolic statement would have an ironic effect. Whether for emphasis or irony, hyperbole is never literal and is always an intentional and obvious exaggeration. Hyperbole is not just something that we use in conversation. Authors have used it as a literary tool for centuries. Take Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example. The character Aegeus is in opposition to the relationship between his daughter and Demetrius, saying, "With cunning hast thou filched my daughter's heart." Obviously, Demetrius did not literally steal the blood-pumping organ from Aegeus's daughter. Saying that he has stolen her heart is an exaggerated way to imply that Aegeus is displeased with the situation. Here's a more recent example from Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. When the Americans and their guards did come out, the sky was black with smoke. The sun was an angry little pinhead. Dresden was like the moon now, nothing but minerals. Here, Vonnegut describes the aftermath of the bombing of Dresden during World War II. The hyperbolic sentence, "Dresden was like the moon now, nothing but minerals," works to emphasize the destruction of the city after its bombing. This arguably has a much more powerful effect than simply saying, "Dresden was badly damaged." The hyperbole here may overstate the extent to which Dresden was damaged, but it drives the point home that the damage was extensive, perhaps difficult to put into language beyond the use of hyperbole for a reader who did not experience the bombing of the city as Vonnegut did in real life. So now that we've looked at hyperbole, let's flip things around and look at understatements. Instead of exaggerating, an understatement works by diminishing or minimizing the facts or situation at hand. Without context, these statements appear to be normal. Let's look at some examples. "I could have done a little better on the test." Without context, you might assume that this person did reasonably well on the test, perhaps scoring an 80 out of 100. However, if this person only made a 20 out of 100, his remark would be an understatement. He obviously could have done a lot better on the test. Other examples would be saying, "It rained a bit more than usual," after a storm that lasted an entire week, or saying, "We've had better games," after losing 70-0. Understatement, then, is often humorous and usually ironic. However, it can also be used sincerely in everyday speech for speakers to minimize or downplay the situation. Take the last example. The football player could be commenting on how terribly the game went in a humorous way, or he could be minimizing the importance of the loss in an attempt to distract from the terrible score so he could move on. Understatement is also used quite often in literature. Here's an example from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. "What, art thou hurt?" Aye, a scratch, marry, 'tis enough. Where is my page? Go, villain, fetch a surgeon." In this scene, Mercutio has been mortally wounded. Understatement appears when he reduces his wound to a mere scratch. Understatement in this case can serve a few purposes. For one, it tells us something about Mercutio as a character. His willingness to call his severe wound a scratch suggests that he is courageous and stoic. Secondly, for readers or viewers of the play, this initial assessment of the wound may lead to the belief that it is not so severe. Thus, realizing later on that the wound is mortal may come as a more dramatic and powerful shock. Let's move into the 20th century with F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. "I've got a nice place here," he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. Here, the extravagantly wealthy Tom Buchanan describes his place as merely nice. The latter description shows that the place is much more than nice, thus calling it such is an understatement. The understatement in this case could say a lot about Tom. He could be attempting to downplay the magnitude of his estate in order to avoid appearing like a braggart, or he may be so used to his wealthy lifestyle that he can only think of what most people would think of as extremely extravagant as nice. Okay, now that we've looked at overstatements and understatement, here's a review question to test your knowledge. Which is an example of hyperbole? A, the man was very tall. B, I would have liked to do a little better. C, the universe could be considered quite large. D, the spider was the size of a Buick. The correct answer is D. Though the spider may be large, saying it is the size of a car is an exaggeration.
Hi, and welcome to this video on thesis statements. A thesis statement is a sentence or two, usually found in the first paragraph of your paper, that briefly explains the purpose of the text, the argument you will be making, and the evidence you'll use to support it. Thesis statements are important because they act as an outline for the paper so the reader knows at a glance what the content of the paper will be. Before you write your thesis, a great deal of research on your potential topic must be done. This will allow you to fine-tune your argument with counter-arguments or evidence to make your thesis stronger. Let's look at some of the elements of a strong thesis statement. If you are provided with a prompt or question to answer, the thesis should clearly state your answer to that prompt. A thesis will have an identifiable perspective on the subject you are writing about. The reader will know your stance on the subject and how you will explain it in greater detail in the paper. Making your thesis a vague blanket statement will cause confusion for the reader. What are you actually writing about? Be specific about what your subject is and make sure your content thereafter follows your thesis. Here are some examples of good and bad thesis statements. Smoking is proven to negatively impact your health. This thesis is very broad. The writer didn't mention what they would talk about in regard to smoking. Do they agree? Will they counter this argument? What are the health risks? Why should the reader care about this subject? These are all questions that could make this thesis stronger. Let's try it again. Because of the health risks associated with smoking and unethical methods for harvesting tobacco, smokers should strive to quit the habit. In this example thesis, the writer is much more specific. They not only give their stance that smokers should quit smoking, but give 2 reasons why they should quit. Let's look at another example. Standardized tests are not useful for students. The sentence gives a stance, but it doesn't state what else the writer will say about standardized tests, nor does it mention evidence to support their statement that these tests are not useful. This could be a decent temporary thesis you can use until you do more research, but it needs more detail. Let's see what a strong example looks like. Standardized tests should not be the sole factor to determine a student's ability, because these tests have a history of bias, and using these scores alone can hinder students from potential educational opportunities. This thesis is very thorough. It not only gives the stance and tells what the paper will be about, but it also gives reasons to support their stance that they will talk about in detail later in the paper. Thesis statements are the solid foundation writers need to compose clear and detailed academic papers. Doing research and having your argument and supporting evidence planned out can help you fine-tune your thesis into a specific topic your readers can easily follow. Hi, and welcome to this video on primary and secondary sources. Determining the difference between primary and secondary sources can be difficult. In essence, primary sources are objects, usually written works, created during a specific time that relate to the specific time or topic that you're studying. A novel or an autobiography would be examples of this. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are texts that analyze, interpret, or comment on primary sources. However, this is only a quick definition of primary sources. As you will see later in the video, what is considered a primary or secondary source can shift depending on context. First, let's define primary and secondary sources more fully and look at some examples before taking a look at how to find them. As previously suggested, primary sources are sources that were created during a specific time and discuss that specific time or topic during that time, and secondary sources comment in some way on these sources. In many cases, secondary sources are meant to be persuasive. Before going too far, let's look at a list of sources considered primary and secondary. Primary sources include creative works such as poems, novels, and plays, diaries and correspondence, original documents like birth certificates, autobiographies, manuscripts, speeches, constitutions and laws, government documents, or a journal article with new findings. Secondary sources include criticisms of art, whether it be literature, film, music, or what have you, journal articles containing analysis or commentary, textbooks, encyclopedias, interpretive or analytical books, or political commentary. Keep in mind that these lists are only partial. Also, there's a good chance that the sources you'll be focusing on in your studies are literary or historical. For instance, it is quite common to be assigned essays about literary works, poems or novels, for example, in which you have to use secondary sources, usually scholarly journal articles, to support your claims about the literary work in question. Things can start to get a little more complicated here. Sometimes primary sources can be considered secondary sources, and some secondary sources can be read as primary sources. It all depends on the context and purpose for which a source is being used. For example, an ancient encyclopedia might be studied as a primary source if it is being analyzed and interpreted in order to learn about the era of its publication. However, encyclopedias usually are considered secondary sources. Don't worry about this too much, though. The primary-secondary source distinction is useful about 99% of the time. Just try to keep in mind that not every source can be pigeonholed into just one category. Now that we know what our sources are, let's look at how you go about finding them in the first place. Finding sources is often a hassle. It can be anxiety-producing, and many students simply do not know where to begin their search. The best place to begin looking is the library. However, in this instance, the library can mean two things. It could mean the actual brick-and-mortar building, or it could mean an online database. The second option is much more user-friendly for citizens of the 21st century and can be accessed through your library's website. If you're attending a university, then try to access the online database through your school's library homepage. Many public libraries and secondary school libraries also offer this option. Search terms will vary between websites, so it's important to experiment with search criteria. For instance, you may find a search filter that allows you to search for only primary sources. As for secondary sources, consider using databases that are commonly subscribed to by educational institutions. EBSCO, JSTOR, and ProQuest, to name a few. There are countless other databases with different specializations ranging from literature to law. Consider searching through the different databases related to your subject in order to find a useful database for you. Ultimately, databases are full of useful secondary sources. If you're unable to access these types of databases, another option for pursuing secondary sources is Google Scholar. Google Scholar is essentially a free-to-use online database of scholarly sources. Though many sources are trapped behind a paywall, this option also provides many free-to-read sources. If you prefer a non-internet approach, consider strolling through the library for books on your chosen topic. And of course, when in need, ask a librarian for help. They are experts at determining primary and secondary sources and will be more than willing to point you in the right direction. Now, let's take a look at some helpful tips to remember as you start putting together your sources. Aim to use credible sources. In terms of secondary sources, articles published in scholarly journals and scholarly books work best and are considered the most reliable. This is due to the fact that they have been peer-reviewed by experts in the field before publication. Personal blogs and Wikipedia are usually not considered credible sources. Remember, anyone can post whatever they like on personal blogs. Wikipedia is open to be edited by anyone, so it also often lacks credibility. It's also a good idea to ask your teacher or professor about what they accept as primary and secondary sources. Instructors have different ideas for what they consider a credible source. When in doubt, ask for clarification. Remember that not all sources are equal. Certain sources, like newspaper editorials or brief news stories about a topic, do not hold as much credibility as scholarly articles and books. First, editorial pieces in newspapers or on websites are often biased and go through little peer review or vetting before publication. Writers of such pieces often have a political axe to grind on, or perhaps worse, are themselves misinformed about the topic. Newspaper articles, though useful in some cases, usually offer only a very shallow reading of an event or topic, which doesn't allow you to get all of the necessary information. Aim for sources closest to the original. What does this mean? Simply put, if you want to discuss a particular writer's work, whether it be a primary or secondary source, try to find the original source. For example, instead of using a summary from Wikipedia or Cliff Notes, aim to familiarize yourself with a primary source. This is important because sources that summarize other sources are removed from the source itself. You never know when a bias can enter the equation or, even worse, false information. If you find a particularly interesting argument used in a secondary source, aim to find where that argument was originally published. Many scholarly sources rely on arguments from previous secondary sources. Therefore, Johnny Smith may use an argument initially created by Jane Johnson in an article he's written. Instead of relying on Johnny Smith's interpretation or summary of Jane Johnson's work, try to go back and find Jane Johnson's original source. This is important because it is possible that Johnny Smith is himself misreading or editorializing Jane Johnson's argument. Therefore, reading the original source prevents the possibility of interpretational bias. In the end, the further away from the original source you go, the higher the chances that the meaning of the original has been twisted or misinterpreted, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Lastly, who is the publisher? Anyone with enough money can start a publishing house. However, certain publishers have more credibility than others. In particular, look for works published by university presses. Though these are not the only credible sources, they are usually a safe bet. When in doubt, consider searching for the publisher's website online in order to get a feel for its credibility. Finally, before we go, let's look at a review question. Which of the following is not a primary source? A, a novel. B, a textbook. C, a diary. Or D, a speech. Correct answer is B, a textbook. A textbook is a secondary source because it is expounding upon or commenting on other sources.
When you're writing, sometimes you need the research and ideas of other people to help make your point. When you do this, it is important that you cite your source, telling your readers exactly where you learned your information from. Citing sources gives credit to the original authors while also legitimizing your point. Today we're going to talk about 3 main ways to cite your sources in a paper: APA, MLA, and Chicago style. All 3 of these styles use the same basic information, but the order changes, in part because different academic fields want to emphasize different parts of the citation. The real purpose of choosing one of these styles in your writing is to make sure you cite every source the same way throughout your paper. You don't want the reader to be confused about how to find the information, and style helps you stay consistent. Often, a teacher will tell you which style they want you to use, but if they don't, pick the one that most fits your content. The first 2 styles are known as in-text citation styles, which means that you give some information about the source directly after the quotation, but leave the rest to a list of references or works cited at the end of the paper. APA is the American Psychological Association Guidelines, and it's a citing method used most often in papers about education, psychology, and the sciences. In APA, you put the name and relevant source information of the author you're citing directly into your text. Let's look at an example. According to Jones, 1998, students often struggle to cite their sources correctly. Page 32. Okay, this might look confusing, but each part of the sentence actually has a purpose in telling us where the quote came from. We see the name of the author being quoted, Jones, the year that the piece he wrote was published, 1998, and the page number upon which we can find the exact quote, page 32. You'll notice that this APA style emphasizes the year the source was published first rather than the page number, which lets the reader see at once how the research has evolved over time. The second in-text style is MLA, defined by the Modern Language Association. MLA is most common in the humanities, papers about art, history, and language. Because humanities research highlights how one original source document influences another, MLA style emphasizes the author's name and the page in the original text you're using. Take a look at our same example from before, but in MLA style. Students often struggle to cite their sources correctly. Jones, 32. See how the name of the author and the page number take prominence? This helps scholars easily track down the poem or piece of prose you're using to further your point. Now, let's talk about Chicago style. If you're writing something related to business, history, or the fine arts, you might use this style of citation, which uses footnotes rather than purely in-text parentheticals. Using footnotes lets the reader focus on the evidence, and information is easily tracked down if the reader wants to do more of their own research. There are two ways to cite a source using Chicago style: the notes method and the author date method. The notes method is very common when writing about the humanities. The author date method is more common in the sciences. The notes method has a reference page and a series of footnotes at the end of every page, telling the reader more about the subject. The author date method has a bibliography, but instead of footnotes, it uses parenthetical citation in the text, listing the author and date of the publication. You've heard me mention bibliographies, reference pages, and works cited pages throughout this video. Those are basically a document at the end of your paper that lists all of your sources in alphabetical order with all the information someone would need to research more on their own and check your statistics. APA, MLA, and Chicago style all have their own handbooks and guides, both in print and online. So once you've chosen your style, research carefully how to record your bibliography, in-text citation, and footnotes. Remember, like with everything, practice makes better. I hope that this video was helpful. If you enjoyed it, then be sure to give us a big thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for future videos. See you guys next time.